Ladies and gentlemen, welcome and thank you for joining today's REN webinar. Please note that all participant lines will be muted until the Q&A portion of the call. We will provide you with instructions on how to ask a verbal question at that point of time. You are welcome to submit written questions during the presentation, and these will be addressed during Q&A. To send a note, please select the Participants menu at the top of your screen and opt to Send Notes to All Presenters. If you're logged in using the web-based application, please use the Notes function on the lower right-hand side of your screen and address your notes to all moderators. If you require any technical assistance, please send a note to the ATT CES operator or call our help desk at 888-796-6118. With that, I'll turn the call over to Elise DeGeorge, Senior Project Leader in the Wind and Water Power Deployment Team at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Elise, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. And welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 10th webinar in our REN webinar series. For those who may not know about REN, REN is the name for International Energy Agency Wind Task 34, which consists of 10 member nations. And REN stands for Working Together to Resolve the Environmental Effects of Wind Energy. So this webinar series was launched in 2014. It's comprised of quarterly webinars developed to support the REN's goals of facilitating international collaboration that advances the global understanding of the environmental effects of wind energy development. And it creates a shared global knowledge base and community of practice around research monitoring and management of environmental effects. Please go to the next slide. Today's webinar is on BOEM's efforts to collect and analyze offshore wind data in a holistic manner as demonstrated through the RODEO study. RODEO stands for Real-Time Opportunity for Development Environmental Observations, and it involves the collection of real-time measurements of the construction and operation of the first offshore wind facilities, the first one in the U.S. being Deepwater Wind's Block Island Wind Farm. This allows for more accurate assessments of the actual environmental effects. We're very lucky today to have Dr. John King of the University of Rhode Island's Graduate School of Oceanography presenting to us on this RODEO study. Dr. King's current research, he has a wide array of current interests, including, I'll just list some of these, geomagnetism, paleomagnetism, coastal and marine habitat and ecosystem studies, and how global climate change affects localities and communities. He teaches a graduate course in environmental magnetism and high-resolution quaternary climate studies, as well as graduate courses in geological oceanography and introduction to marine pollution. After Dr. King's presentation, Andrea Copping of the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory will be facilitating the questions and answers portion of this webinar. So over to you, John. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. There's two basic talks that I'm going to give today. You'll notice that the first one is entitled Lessons Learned from the Monitoring of Environmental Effects of Construction of the First Offshore Wind Farm in the U.S. There's a lot of different studies going on as part of RODEO at the Block Island Wind Farm. This particular talk, I'm subbing in for Jim Miller, and it's focused on acoustics. And while I do know a bit about acoustics, Jim and Gopu Padi are the actual experts. They had a conflict and could not participate today, so I'm subbing in for them. Could we go to the next slide, Ruchi? Basically, this is the acknowledgement that you can see that there were a large number of co-authors. Most of these studies are pretty complex, and the listing of the logos was on the previous slide. You could see many, many logos there. So we wish to acknowledge these folks who participated in the study. Next slide, please, Ruchi. as context, there's a lot of offshore wind development going on in New England area. We're focused on the southern New England area, specifically the Block Island Wind Farm, which is 5 turbines in state waters. It's right on the kind of the 3.5 mile line off of Block Island. You can also see some of the other development areas like the Rhode Island, Massachusetts area of mutual interest and the Massachusetts wind energy area, and you can see the potential number of turbines that could be located in each of those areas. Deepwater Wind is actually started on a second lease agreement and development agreement in the area of mutual interest. That one will connect over to the eastern tip of Long Island. If we look over to the kind of far right, we can see the Cape Wind. We're mostly focusing on happy stories today. That's a relatively unhappy story. As you can see, construction was supposed to begin in 2013. I think that project is largely defunct at this point. So things are starting to ramp up in this area, and at least the second project, which will be located in federal waters, is kind of kicked off, and Block Island, Massachusetts area of mutual interest. There is a energy sales agreement in place for that, and that seems to be the critical ingredient to success for these projects. Next slide, please. So, Block Island Wind Farm, the construction took place in late 2015. It's a 30-megawatt farm consisting of 5 turbines, and the water depths of the foundations are located at about 30 meters of water. The substructure for these turbines consists of jacket-type construction with 4 piles located at the corners of the foundation structure to pin it to the seabed. You can see the barge with a couple of foundation structures. Now, the foundations are in 2 pieces. The base, only the very top of the base is painted yellow. This is the top part of the structure, which gets bolted to the base, and the turbine is actually mounted on those upper pieces of the foundation structure. And all of the components were fabricated in Quonset Point in Narragansett Bay and then barged out to the installation site. And on the right-hand side of this diagram, you can see the turbine locations just located inside state waters, which is the dashed line around Block Island. And you can see the green transmission line takes the power from the turbines and brings it into Block Island. There's a substation on Block Island that is also connected to the national grid, and then there's a second transmission line in sort of the orange color that goes to the mainland, and it lands at Scarborough Beach in Narragansett. Next slide, please. There were 2 phases of construction. I'll call it the highly successful and the not so successful. You can see on the right-hand side, the upper diagram shows a construction barge, which Weeks Construction was the contractor on this phase. That apparently is the largest barge on the East Coast and had a pretty large crane on the barge. Pile driving with that setup was a real adventure. It was not particularly successful. They started to have real success when they went to the jackup rig, which is on the lower right-hand side. I'd make the analogy is that if you try to drive a nail at some distance above your head, it's not always easy to do. That's what ladders are for. So the jackup rig was essentially a ladder, and the pile driving went really successfully from the jackup rig. Some of the piles were driven in less than half an hour, and often from the barge it would take an inordinate amount of time, and there was a lot of equipment failures associated with trying it from the barge. So I think, at least with this type of foundation, and you can see that the piles are not being driven straight down. They're being driven in at an angle of about 13 degrees from the vertical. So the foundations actually are kind of a true lattice, and the 4 pin piles are at a pretty extreme angle, as you can see in the lower diagram. Next slide, please. So the initial focus was on looking at the acoustic propagation from the pile driving in the construction phase. And what was really interesting about this study is that modeling had been done by Reinhold and Dahl on vertical pile driving. No one had actually looked at this off of vertical style of pile driving. And there are a couple of differences. Basically, a compressional wave speed in the steel itself is about 5,900 meters per second, and the propagation speed in the water is about 1,500 meters per second. This strong contrast in the compressional wave velocity creates a Mach wave in the water and the sediment, which has a angle of about 15 degrees with the vertical. Now that's with vertical pile driving. When you go off of vertical, things change a bit. Next slide, please. Essentially, you get the angle of the Mach wave at about 15 degrees in the water with respect to the vertical, and because you have an angle of about 13 degrees that you're driving the pile at, the actual Mach wave seems to propagate downward only about 2 degrees off the vertical. So when the pile driving is occurring off of vertical, the sound propagation becomes nearly vertical. And the net effect is that an awful lot more energy is absorbed by the seafloor in this angled pile driving than in vertical pile driving. And modeling is now underway on the data gathered in this project to kind of quantify this, and it's three-dimensional modeling as opposed to two-dimensional modeling. Next slide, please. So let me give you an overview of the measurements that were done during construction. My involvement in this project is that I'm the guy that owns the research vessel that you see depicted there. So while I was in on all the meetings, I was mostly in charge of the logistics for getting the instruments deployed rather than the data generation piece. So there were several instruments shown. We had a towable sled that had a tetrahedron of hydrophones on it. We had a hydrophone that was deployed from the boat. These two instruments were used in the particle velocity part of the study. And then another component of the study consisted of propagation of sound away from the construction site. So we studied that with the sled. We also used a towed array of hydrophones from the boat. And then we had a couple of vertical arrays of hydrophones that were deployed quite some distance from the structure. You'll note the 500-meter scale on the bottom. There was an exclusionary zone around the structures during construction. We weren't allowed to do any measurements any closer than 500 meters. So the sled was towed at about exactly that distance. The first time we did a deployment, our furthest station was only about 7.5 kilometers away from the structure, and we noted that we weren't really capturing the far field. The sound propagated so well that it was pretty 0.5 meters. So the next time around, we put another station in that was 15 kilometers away. Next slide, please. So this just shows a summary of all the data collection activities. Started in August of 15, and it continued until about the end of October 15. And basically, one of the big difficulties in this study was coordination, because the developer, whenever C-state was correct and they were ready, they just went. And sometimes we had decent notice of what they planned to do, and we would go out there, and sometimes they did it and sometimes they didn't. And once they got good at driving the piles, it went so fast that the coordination piece of the study was probably the most difficult. And I'm not sure that on any wind development project it's going to be any different. Once they got good at driving piles, the 5 installations seemed to go so fast that there wasn't that much of a window for actual data collection. Next slide, please. So the characteristics, the towed array, towed hydrophone array, we use that to collect data on both September 2nd and September 15th. It was a digitized 64 kilohertz per channel data set. We used Woods Hole depth sensors to measure the array depth. Data storage was done in real time, but the data processing is post field work onshore. Next slide, please. This is an example of the type of data gathered by the towed array. You can see the strong acoustic pulses. That's about the timing of the strikes. Every few seconds, you'd have a hammer strike. Next slide, please. So the peak-to-peak sound pressure levels, I'm going to stick with decibels. Basically, you can see the distance from the pile strike. This data was gathered at 1,000 meters or more, and you can see that we're at about the 180 decibel level up to the 190 decibel level. And there was some variation between September 2nd and September 17th. September 17th, we were capturing the full range. There was some clipping of the data, meaning that some of the data was going beyond 190, and we weren't really capturing that. We were essentially saturating the sensors. Next slide, please. This shows the geophysical sled, essentially a framework with a heavy weight that's skidded along the bottom. It's got the tetrahedral array, and that was used for the acoustic particle velocity component of the study, which tied into study of impacts on fish. We deployed that as close as we could on 2 of the turbine structures, and basically on the right you can see the surface floats for the sled as it's being towed. We kind of kept track of the location of the sled by sort of a GPS reading from that surface float. It, in theory, went straight down to the sled. Next slide, please. So this is the type of data that was obtained using the tetrahedral array. Sometimes it was towed, sometimes it was just dropped to the bottom and it stayed in the same position. And we were getting a peak-to-peak reading of about 109 decibels, and if you do some modeling and assume spherical spreading, that indicates that the actual sound level was about 248 decibels right next to the piling. That's actually pretty high. Next slide, please. So the last part of our arrays were called SHREWs. It's just the acronym for several hydrophone receiver units. Those are out of Woods Hole, and it's kind of a standard passive monitoring system, and we had one at 7.5 kilometers away and another one at 15 kilometers away on our second deployment. Next slide, please. So we can see the impact pile driving signals at the shrew, and even at 7.5 kilometers away, we were getting some clipping, which indicates that the sensors were getting saturated that far away from the pile strikes. But you can see the pulse-like nature of the pile strikes in the data. Next slide, please. This slide is a summary of the measurements during construction. You can see that there's a bit of offset between the data sets captured on the two dates. Some of that involves the angle at which the pile is being driven into the bottom relative to your sensors. And generally during the 9.2 measurement sequence, the sound was higher than it was on 9.17. I don't know that they were driving any more quietly on 9.17. I think it had more to do with the geometry. Next slide, please. So we did a similar suite of sensors to monitor operations once the construction phase was over, and this part of the measurement was done between December 20th, 2016 to January 14th, 2017. And the equipment, again, involved that tetrahedral array and two vertical hydrophone arrays located at 100 meters and 7.5 kilometers from one of the turbines. Next slide, please. You can see that the turbine noise looks like it's focused at 70 hertz, and then there's other harmonics above that. We were able to measure up to about 200 hertz. One thing that was relatively interesting during this deployment is that you can see that there's a 20 hertz signal that was a vocalizing fin whale that was in the study area at the same time that this was being done. That was also picked up, the fin whale was also picked up by other passive monitoring devices. Next slide, please. So, some conclusions about this study. What did we do right? Using a combination of the fixed and mobile sensors was a good idea. It provided enough data to do 3D modeling, and you picked up different aspects of sound propagation using that combination. And setting multiple hydrophones to different gains was a good idea because some saturated and some didn't. So you were actually able to capture the most intense sound. Deploying the sensors at different locations in various ranges was a good idea. The equipment performed quite well. Typically, when you're dealing with these sorts of sensors, if you're getting 90% performance, you feel pretty good about this. This was about 100%, which is pretty unusual. So all the sensors worked, and we collected data at all the stations that we had sensors at. There were some issues, what we could have done better. The coordination in scheduling was extremely difficult. We can try to do that better, but I think the vagaries of when the developer is operating and when they're not, we essentially had about an hour and 15-minute transit from where the boat was located out to the site, and sometimes that was enough to throw things off significantly. It would be nice to have more measurements closer to the pile. I think now that this installation has been done, we're hopeful that at least some of the time we might be able to get inside of that 500-meter exclusion zone and get some measurements closer to the pile. That may consist of deploying something right next to the pile and then getting out of there. I don't think they're going to allow vessels to be cruising along closer, but we could install sensors and then move off. We weren't really allowed to have anything within 500 meters of the construction. We need some more measurements at a distance too, because at least some of the time the sound was pretty intense even that far away from the construction. One data set that's a little bit limited is it would be nice to have more particle velocity measurements in mid-water. We have them at the bottom, but it would be nice to have some more in mid-water. And this is a bit of a scientific oversight on our part. It's nice to have temperature and salinity data in conjunction with these sorts of studies. And we did some CTD casts, but it would be nice to actually have sensors right on the vertical hydrophone arrays next time around. Next slide, please. So the next steps. This study is ongoing. We have to fully analyze the data at all locations for all the pile driving events. We have good preliminary results, but we need to finalize some analyses to get better measurements on the sound pressure level and the sound exposure level and also the kurtosis of the sound. The computations on the particle velocity using the tetrahedral array are ongoing, and there were some other sensors in use for fish studies, and integrating that data needs to be done. The 3D modeling is underway, and that's working with Sandia National Laboratory, and they're using a couple of different types of models. And I don't know much about the modeling, so don't ask me about it. And one kind of serendipitous result is the FinWave calls that were recorded. We're kind of looking into this type of sensor arrangement to try and come up with a passive acoustic monitoring, kind of ongoing monitoring array located next to these wind farms in Rhode Island state waters and adjacent federal waters. And that's in the process of being discussed now for funding, and I think that will be a collaborative effort between URI and WHOI moving forward to actually have a permanent monitoring in the study area. So I'll end on that note. One of the things that was kind of interesting is how intense the sound is associated with this pile driving. So, Ruki, if I could ask you to play the recording that was made at 7.5 kilometers away during construction, so people get a feel for this.
Sure.
Okay, thanks. I think we get the idea. It's pretty loud. It's some distance away from the structure, and I have friends who do a lot of scuba diving in an area that's located about slightly more than 3 miles away from the construction, and basically they said that they could take it for about 10 minutes, and then they had to get out of the water. So I imagine that other organisms, whether permanent or temporary, like the scuba divers, probably didn't stick around when the pile driving was ongoing. So that concludes the initial presentation, and that is part of rodeo. If people want me to segue right into the next one, this is one that I am the PI on, and I have more expertise in this area. Interestingly enough, this is not actually part of rodeo. This was a contract that was let by BOEM before they actually let the contracts for for rodeo. Basically, this is to look at the electromagnetic field, both magnetic and electrical field impacts on marine organisms from direct current cables. The cables on the Block Island project are actually AC cables, and they're somewhat simpler than the DC cables that we're studying. For instance, most of the work to date has been done on the Cross-Sound cable, which connects New Haven, Connecticut across Long Island Sound to northern Long Island, and it's a 330 megawatt cable. It's not a real high capacity cable. We're also studying the Neptune cable, which connects Long Island to northern New Jersey. That's a 660 megawatt cable, so roughly double the capacity. This study was kind of in response to the concept of call it the Google cable, although I don't know what the status of that project was. Basically, the Google cable was going to be the backbone connecting all the wind farms from the Mid-Atlantic up to New York, and it was going to be a really large, really long DC cable. So the idea was to study some existing cables for effects on organisms like skates and sharks that we know are affected by these fields, and then the American lobster, which we really didn't have much data on whether they're affected. And of course, if you see effects, that does not necessarily imply impacts, but it could imply impacts depending on what the effects are. So this study was to capture those sorts of things. Next slide, please. Again, a large number of collaborators. The PIs are primarily Andrew Gill, a biologist, Zoe Hutchinson, a biologist, Peter Seagray, who is an expert on various sensors. You can see his affiliation as the Swedish Defense Agency. When he's not trying to sense Russian submarines, he's working with scientists on these kind of projects. And Haibo He, who's an electrical engineer who does modeling, and there's a modeling component to this study as well as a field component. Next, please. So, Cross-Sound cable was selected because, at least at one point in time, there was a pretty active lobster fishery in the west end of Long Island Sound. These days, there's not much of a commercial fishery there anymore due to various things like anoxia/hypoxia and kind of rampant shell disease that no one really has a complete handle on what's causing that, but it's pretty severe in western Long Island Sound and has affected the populations. We actually determined that there wasn't enough of a lobster population in western Long Island Sound to actually capture lobsters to use in the study. So we were using Rhode Island lobsters, which are still relatively abundant, to do our field studies. And the various components of this study is we went out with a device developed by Peter that's called the SEMLA. It's a magnetometer and electrical field sensor array. SEMLA is an acronym that stands for Stockholm Electric and Magnetic Field Low Noise Apparatus, and that's. I think Peter just came up with that because if anyone's been to the Scandinavian countries, there's a cream puff with maraschino cherry on top, which is actually a SEMLA. So he named it after this Scandinavian pastry. Anyway, we did surveys. If you look at the diagram in the upper right-hand corner, that shows our survey lines across the Cross-Sound cable. And little bit of background. The cross-sound cable was installed, and in the area right outside of New Haven Harbor, which is our study area, you can see the shipping channel going into New Haven Harbor. It did not make project depth, and there were lots of lawsuits and conundrums over this because it was supposed to be 2 meters below the surface, and it probably is closer to 1 meter below the surface in the area that we did this study. There was about a $20 million lawsuit settlement that was paid to the state of Connecticut because of potential effects due to the transmission cable not making project depth. And lots of environmental studies in Long Island Sound have been funded out of that settlement fund. So basically, the SEMLA is towed perpendicular to the cable, and profiles of magnetic field like the one in the lower right-hand corner are obtained. And you can see that instead of a symmetrical magnetic field with a peak, we get a negative anomaly and then we get a positive anomaly. And that's because the construction of the cross-sound cable, it's actually 2 cables located supposedly next to each other. And what we found in this study is that most of the time they're located next to each other, and when you're crossing the first cable, you get the negative anomaly, and then when you go over the second cable, you get the positive anomaly, and as you move off, you reach background values. But the other thing that we noticed is that the cable appears to be twisted, and you can get the 2 cables stacked, and if they're stacked vertically one over the top of the other, you do get a symmetrical peak of some size from that configuration. And then other times, the cables are not symmetrical. One's smaller, one's larger. Sometimes the orientation of the 2 cables is flipped, and then you get the negative anomaly and the positive anomaly in the other direction. So it's a little more complicated than we had hoped. But next slide, please. The goal of the SEMLA studies, and this diagram shows various views of Peter C. Gray standing on the left-hand side, looking at the data coming in. Well, actually, the SEMLA is not deployed yet. It's on the fantail of my research vessel. He's making sure that it's actually taking readings. Then it's deployed off of the vessel and dragged along the seafloor. If you look at the close-up of the SEMLA in the upper right-hand corner, you can see the green and yellow tape. Those are electrical sensors, and you can see that they're configured in a 3-axis configuration. So you're measuring electrical fields in 3 axes, and the sensors are in the white pressure case located right below the PVC pipe with the tape on it. Now, if you look in the lower right-hand corner, you can see another pressure case near the skids. That's actually a 3-axis magnetometer. So this thing is measuring magnetic fields in 3 axes and electrical fields in 3 axes simultaneously. Next slide, please. So here's the data that we obtained on the cross-sound cable. And you can see that sometimes you have the symmetrical peak. The light blue one in the middle is an example of that. The blue one kind of nearest to us is probably where the cable is shallowest, so you get the highest peak, and that's from the cable being magnetic, because you can see that these measurements are done in shutdown mode. This is the cable shut down for maintenance, so the only thing we're looking at there are permanent magnetic fields being generated from the cable, which is somewhat magnetic. And you can see that the field strength is probably, sort of 46 to about 47 microtesla in this configuration. Next slide, please. In standby mode, there actually is voltage in the cable. It's just not really very high, but you can see that the peaks are only slightly higher, and they have the same general configuration in standby mode. And one thing that's sort of interesting is a lot of the modeling done predicts that these magnetic anomalies associated with the cable spatially are very peaked, and they do not spread that far off of the cable. And what we found is both the magnetic fields and the electrical fields are a little broader in reality than you would predict just by modeling them. And of course, the peaks are a little more complex than we thought we were going to see. So this is one of three configurations. You can have it in shutdown mode, you can have it in standby mode, and next slide, please. This is when it's operating at full power, and you can see that the profiles look pretty similar, but the range is increased, and you know you're getting about 15 extra microteslas when the cable is operating at full power. And you can see that the distance off of the cable is a few meters anyway for the magnetic field. Next slide, please. This is the electrical field in shutdown mode, and we're mostly just looking at sensor noise and electrical noise in the environment. There's plenty of electrical noise out there, and you can see that the electrical fields in volts per meter are actually pretty low. Next slide, please. When the cable is at full power, we see some pretty interesting things. The volts per meter pick up considerably, and the one thing that was sort of a surprise is how far the electrical fields extend off of the cable. You know, from background to background, we're actually looking at higher electrical fields that are at least a couple hundred meters wide than background, and you can kind of see that they're not symmetrical, and again, that's dependent on whether it's two strands, the two cables in vertical and horizontal, and in which orientation they're in. That one transect, it kind of peaks up on one end. It appears that there was some other stray electrical field in the environment out there. We don't know if there's other cables out there, and we're not sure what we picked up there, but that's kind of a strange set of data. And since it's the only one, it's not typical. So this magnetic field, interestingly enough, it's not DC, even though this is a DC cable. So this is AC fields, and it's mostly at 180 hertz. So it's a harmonic of 60. So next slide, please. Okay, so we found the high spot on the cable, and basically what we were planning on doing is putting enclosures, netted enclosures over the cable, and putting test organisms in one enclosure located on the cable and another one some distance off the cable at background values, the control site. And this sort of shows the configuration of the experimental apparatus. We had a bunch of electronics and pressure cases sitting on a floating platform. We had 6 hydrophones located around this enclosure. The size of the enclosure is about 6 meters by 8 meters by 2.5 meters high. And what we did is we put acoustic telemetry tags on the organisms, put them in the enclosure for 24-hour deployments, and then we monitored their movements with the hydrophones acoustically. Next slide, please. This is the enclosure on land in beautiful North New Haven. You can see an abandoned coal-fired power plant right across the canal. So basically we're building this thing in a shipyard, loading it on a vessel, and then deploying it on the cable and at the control site. You can see one of the hydrophones on the lower right We had 4 in the upper corners of the enclosure and then 2 located lower. Basically, with the 6 hydrophone array, you could monitor organisms moving around with an accuracy of about 10 to 15 centimeters. You could monitor their movements in 2 dimensions or 3 dimensions, and you got a reading every 6 seconds. Next slide, please. I'll go through these quickly. This just shows the deployment of the enclosures. We had to use a 72-foot landing craft type vessel with a crane to deploy these things. So you can see one of the enclosures on the Jennifer Miller on the upper right. On the lower right, it shows us lifting the enclosure and then getting ready to deploy it. Simultaneously, we were using a very accurate magnetometer dragged along the bottom to determine where the cable was, and I was pretty amazed at this. We got the enclosure right on top of the cable on the first try, and if you'd told me we were going to do that, I would have said no way. Sometimes it's better to be lucky than good, I think. So next slide, please. So you can see the floating platform has now been deployed, and this is the Shanna Rose, which is the URI research vessel that most of the work was done in. So that's the deployment of our electronics platform. Next slide, please. And once the electronics are on the platform, the exchanges of organisms are done by diver. We initially thought we were just going to pick the enclosures up and switch out the organisms, but after realizing how hard it was to get the enclosure on the cable and how precarious the deployment was, we decided, okay, we're going to use divers. We're not going to try and lift these things up every day and read them. And you have 3 divers, 2 on the bottom, 1 as a safety diver. We had a helmet with surface comms, and we had to have a person monitoring communications because the divers had to go in and out of these netted enclosures. Next slide, please. So this shows the surface crew actually gathering the data. The electronics are on the lower right-hand side. The company that makes both the acoustic tags and the hydrophones and the controller for all this is called HTI. At the end of the data collection part of this study, I can recommend HTI. If you had asked me in the middle of this study, I would have uttered some things that would be bleeped out. Basically, we had lots of trouble with the acoustic tags, and I think in the early phases of the study, we were doing the QA/QC for the company, which is not my preference. Next slide, please. So we have to capture specimens. Well, we have a fish trawl survey every week at Graduate School of Oceanography. So we studied lobsters and skates. We used a lobsterman to capture the lobsters who we did scientific studies with, and then we used the GSO fish trawl to capture the skates. Skates are relatively delicate critters, and commercial trawls just massacre them. Our fish trawl is sort of gentler and shorter, and we were able to get about 80% vitality out of the things that were captured in our fish trawl. Next slide, please. So this shows a skate with one of the acoustic tags on it. They're not small, so you need pretty sizable organisms. They don't seem to affect the skates much. And you can see the same style acoustic tag mounted on a lobster. We have these little harnesses for the lobsters. Lobsters didn't seem to mind the tags. Actually, there's a little antenna on the tag off to the side, the little nubbin. They actually like to eat those, and that was we had to take measures because the tags are about $400 a piece, and the lobsters consider them somewhat tasty. That was only when there were a bunch of them in an aquarium enclosure. They didn't seem to eat the tags when we had them out in the field in the larger enclosures. Next slide, please. So, well, I don't see any image here. Is there a murky green image of what the cage looks like underwater?
No, we do have a blank white screen. Right.
Okay. Well, anyway, we were also using GoPros to ground truth our acoustic tags, and this was supposed to answer the question of why didn't you just use GoPros? Okay. You couldn't always see entirely across the enclosure with the GoPros. These are pretty murky urban waters. GoPro batteries are not intended for 24-hour deployments, and they don't show much at night. So they were basically just used the GoPros to ground truth our acoustic measurements. Next slide, please. So examples of the data. Because you're getting a reading every 6 seconds, if you look at the upper right-hand corner, below shows you the X, Y, Z coordinates of an average data point. And you can see how much data you're actually gathering with 5 lobsters in the enclosure in 1 hour. And if you break this down into individual data sets, we've ground truthed it with the GoPro video, and we've done some statistics that the company has suggested. And the accuracy of the position seems to be about 10 centimeters. And this is kind of a major achievement in terms of proof of concept. Most of these types of studies, you only get a data point every minute, and the accuracy is more like a meter or slightly worse than a meter. So this technology is I think, going to be a big deal for behavioral studies of marine organisms. Next slide, please. So these are typical examples of preliminary data. You can see the lobsters we did a lot of studies of lobsters because little was known about them. A true replicate is when you have the same set of critters for a 24-hour deployment on the cable and then another 24-hour deployment at the control. So we did a lot of lobsters. We did somewhat fewer skates because there is a literature on impact of electromagnetic fields on skates. So we were mostly just supplementing that with the new technology. Next slide, please. So what sorts of things can the data tell us? I think we've proved that you can do it for multiple individuals within a mesocosm, and we confirmed that the precision and accuracy of the 3D positioning, it was actually, we were hoping for 25 to 30 centimeters, and it was better than that. So we can now assess various types of behavior in 2D or in 3D. So you can look at group behavior with respect to the cable versus no cable. You can study behavior in response to the orientation and the presence of VMF and when it's not present. And frequency and duration of any association, the measurements are close enough together that you can do that. So we can look at attraction, we can look at repulsion, we can look at speed of movement with or without EMF and close to and away from the cable. This angle of turning when an organism approaches something that it doesn't like or it does like is supposedly significant. So we can look at that, and then we can look at influences of tides, time of day, light, and other environmental variables. We also monitored current speed and oxygen content. So we'll pretty much figure out the limitations of the interpretation on these acoustic tags, but I think this technology is going to be extremely useful moving forward. Next slide, please. So the next steps, we're heavy into the analysis of the animal behavior data from the acoustic data and the GoPro footage. We're about to go survey the Neptune cable. We did not get that done before the end of the field season. And perhaps moving forward, we can continue the study with American eels. The original intent was to include them, and we basically ran out of time before the migration season for American eels ended. We were sort of finishing up, even though we were there at the crack of dawn, and we stayed until sunset on a lot of days. We didn't get the study done before the eels were no longer migrating. So that might come this year if federal funding levels willing. We'll see about that. So that's the end of that presentation, and I turn it over to the Wren folks again.
Hello, this is Andrea Copping with Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. John, thank you very much for an excellent pair of presentations. We do have several questions, if that would be all right.
Sure.
I'd like to go ahead and ask you. I'll try and organize them maybe a little bit with some of the acoustic questions first.
So the ones I won't know the answers to first. Okay.
Some of them may be simple. So we have a question. Were any observations made on the reactions of marine mammals to the noise produced during pile driving?
No, that really wasn't part of this study. I think part of the reason that this passive acoustic monitoring array is being set up is for the next installation, which that's going to be a while, at least a year and a half, I think, before that next wind farm comes into play. The idea is to have that passive monitoring system set up before then, and then actually do some of those kinds of studies next time around.
Great. Another question on the sound propagation modeling. You noted that you did not have temperature or salinity sensors right at the pilings. When the propagation modeling was done, were there in fact the density measurements, other oceanographic data used as part of that modeling?
I think so, and I think the data was along the lines of CTD casts that were done periodically, which, I do a lot of geophysical survey mapping, and like if you have any sort of stratification in the system, which isn't highly likely at the time of the year in that study area, that's absolutely critical to have that. I think the CTD casts are a poor substitute for actually having detailed sensor data right at the same location, but I think that's what we've got.
Okay, thanks. Great, honest answer, and I agree with you. A couple more acoustic questions.
Sure.
You did all your measurements of the pile driving of the noise propagation on the seaward side of Block Island of the project, and no measurements between there and Block Island. Was that just a sort of experimental setup, or was there a reason for that?
Yeah, basically there's not enough distance between the wind farm and Block Island. You'd be picking up a lot of noise from Block Island. You could probably get a 7.5 kilometer measurement, but you'd be in close to shore if you went toward Block Island. And and then after the initial study was done, and we realized that 7.5 isn't really far enough away. We've got to go double that. There wouldn't have been any easy way to do that. And,
okay, no, that's fair.
And one of the issues is the activity level during the construction phase of surface vessels in there. It wouldn't be a very clean data set if you set it up toward Block Island. There's an amazing number of construction vessels moving around in that area.
Oh, great. Yeah, no, great answer. One last acoustic question I see at the moment. Clearly, at your 500-meter distance, if your estimated sound pressure levels are close to 250 decibels, obviously this is very high sound that is likely to disturb.
Could I just
go ahead.
That was when the measurement at 500 meters was not that. That's a calculation at 1 meter distance based on the measurement at 500 meters.
Oh, okay. Oh,
I'm sorry I didn't make that clear. That's a calculated value. I think the measured value is around 190 at 500 meters, and if you calculate back to 1 meter from the source, then it becomes the 248. I don't think that would be an allowable value at 500 meters. That's noisy.
It's really noisy. So the question went on to ask, just sort of if you'd be willing to speculate, in watching these operations, did any particular mitigation strategies suggest themselves to you?
Well, it's going to get even more interesting because I'm sort of following construction techniques, and some of the techniques they're talking about in the federal area, they're actually talking about underwater pile driving. So that'll change things considerably, and I think you're probably going to have to get into bubble curtains or something like that if you're doing underwater pile driving. I know there's discussions afoot of that. The one thing I did notice, and unfortunately I don't think we have measurements on it. Jim might have some, but they were using a different hammer type when they were having their little fiascos off of the barge, and they switched to a hydraulic hammer. And believe it or not, the hydraulic hammer was what you heard. That was less noisy than the initial hammer. And the hydraulic hammer came from Spain, so it was called the Spanish hammer. So it seemed to me that the Spanish hammer was a best practice relative to the other one. The other one also kept failing and dropping to the deck. Until they switched to that jackup rig, I was thinking that there was going to be some sort of major accident on the construction phase of this project. You just listen to the radio chatter coming off of the construction when you're out on the boat, and it sounded like a hazardous workplace, shall we say.
Scary stuff. Thank you. Okay, let's switch to some of the EMFs and work. We have a question here. In looking at the electromagnetic fields from the cable, did you notice significant differences between the organism's behavior within the experimental enclosure and the control area?
Maybe. We're kind of still analyzing the data, and I sort of, in a statistical sense, we're not there yet. In a just looking at it sense, the lobsters in particular, in the control area, and of course, it varied by individual, but one of the standard techniques, they sort of separated into climbers and sort of perimeter walkers. So in the control area, you'd have certain lobsters that they would just march around and around, exploring the edges of the enclosure, and then there were others that would just kind of explore the verticality of the environment. They would just keep climbing the sides of the cage, going back to the bottom, and then climbing again. It seemed to me, just looking at the data, is that there was a little less marching around the perimeter going on the cable, which that maybe indicates that they don't like crossing the cable. But that's just anecdotal. you can kind of see a pattern when those things are deployed for long periods of time. Basically, if you decimate the data set, if you look at 24 hours, it's too many data points. It's kind of hard to see any pattern. If you start breaking it into 1 hour or 3 hour blocks, you can kind of see the areas that they tended to patrol, and that's my observation just looking at those 3 hour blocks of data, that there seemed to be a little less crossing of the cable going on in terms of the perimeter marchers anyway.
Great. So another question that sort of leads on from there is, did you get any sense that the animals in the enclosure over the cable were acclimating to the EMF signal over the time of the experiment?
We're not there yet.
Okay.
It's as you might imagine, it's a pretty significant amount of data, and I would say if you were to ask me that question in about 4 months, I'd have an intelligent answer. Right now, it's just be speculation, strictly.
Terrific. Okay, great. Two more maybe quick EMS questions. Was this the same electromagnetic sensing system that was used in the Marvin studies in the North Sea?
Exactly. Peter and Andrew were involved in those studies, and actually Peter was involved in a lot of the acoustic studies there as well. That Marvin kind of did acoustics and field studies simultaneously, and I kind of wish on the acoustic study in Block Island, Peter has a pretty clever set of sensors that might have been better for some of the particle velocity things that were done at Block Island. I'm not in that field in particular, but I follow it a bit, and that was the only part of the Block Island study that kind of had me scratching my head. The Jim Miller's studies were really well done, I thought, and I'm trying to think. I think Fugro might have been responsible for the particle velocity stuff, and they were using a different method than Peter's because his method's complicated. But to be honest, after kind of doing a side by side, I think Peter's is better.
Great. And one last EMF question. Why did you choose to study a DC cable rather than an AC cable? Because at the moment, most of the wind farms that are planned in the U.S. are using AC cables.
That question implies that I had a choice.
No.
The RFP specifically said DC cables. I think the idea was that, the question at the time was, okay, if something like that Google cable ever gets built, it's going to be a DC cable, and it's going to be the biggest one anybody's ever seen. Can we study some existing DC cables and then come up with a scalable model of what sort of fields will be generated as the capacity of the cable goes up? And that's Haibo He's part of the study, and we are trying to develop that model. I think my understanding is that people aren't so worried about AC cables, and I can tell you that if you have a well-balanced AC cable, that's i.e. the voltage in all three phases in the cable are approximately the same, yeah, most of the fields cancel out. But keeping the cable in balance is non-trivial. The grid doesn't do a very good job of that on land, so I have no reason to believe they're going to do a much better job of it underwater. And if the cables get out of balance, then you start to see some pretty significant leakage into the environment.
Okay, that's great. So it sounds like this study really was trying to look towards some of the more likely future use of cables for offshore wind. Great. Yeah. Okay, I think that's all the questions I see. Am I missing any? I don't think so. So if We will give the audience one more quick chance to provide any questions.
Ladies and gentlemen,
And
if you wish to, please go ahead, Andrea.
yeah, why don't you go to the next slide? We'll still allow a little bit more written questions if there are any. This was a great webinar. John, thank you very much. As Elise said at the beginning, this is the 10th webinar in REN's webinar series, and each providing the perspectives on research monitoring methodologies, et cetera. If you got to this webinar not necessarily having been given a invitation, you can sign up to receive future webinar invitations by the work that's on the link that's on the slide. I also want to point out that this webinar differs a little bit from previous REN webinars because ordinarily we will have speakers from more than one nation. We will be following up this REN webinar with another on June 20th with a similar kind of outlook. We will have two European programs featured, one the Vattenfall European Offshore Wind Deployment Center Research Program, and also one out of the Netherlands. The program name is WOZEP, and we will have on the webinar page on TSIS, we will have this PDFs listed that you can examine for those two next webinars. This webinar has been recorded, and the slides, the video of the slides and the audio of both the presentation and the Q&A will be posted on TSIS as you see in that slide. Is there one more slide? Thank you. So I'll just pause for a moment. I don't see any more questions, so we will be letting John off the hook here. And there you see contact information for the three REN operating agent team, Karen Sinclair at NREL, myself, and Jocelyn Brown-Serafino at the Department of Energy. If there's nothing else, I think we will sign off here. Again, thank you to John, and thanks for all the participants.
Well, thank you for listening. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.